what we're talking about is, do the drugs work? And everyone talking here is talking about drugs and talking about the money-making side of it and how it may be good for a few people but maybe not for the greater whole, and that the interest in manipulating science to benefit the sale of that drug or make it look better than it is. I agree with all of that. But imagine if any one of these products they were talking about, you didn't have a choice. Imagine if you couldn't walk out the door. Every one of these products these people are talking about right now, you can get up and say, you know what, I went to a panel the other day and I heard some very important information and I don't think I need that statin, or I don't think I need that psychotropic drug. I'm going to go ahead and leave your office. The products that I'm talking about and that I'm deeply involved with, we have no choice. Imagine this industry that's as corrupt as everybody these up here has talked about, that is interested in money as they're all talking about, could actually mandate products upon you that you wouldn't have a choice. That's what we have with vaccines. And we talk about clinical trials, you know, how clinical trials could be manipulated for drugs. We can't even get clinical trials for vaccines. You know why? They say it would be unethical to do them. How perfect. How perfect. So instead of doing the clinical trial and having to manipulate it, let's just not do it at all and say it would be unethical to even perform the trial at all. That's what vaccines are doing. And that's just the beginning of it. And you talk about, does a vaccine work? How about the mumps outbreak at Harvard? Every single person in that outbreak this year had gotten 2, not 1, had gotten their booster for the MMR. And what do we say? What did all the newspapers report? What is the discussion? Not, does the MMR work? The discussion is, do we need a 3rd booster? Imagine this product is mandated on us. When it doesn't work, they ask us to buy another one. I mean, you can't beat that product line. The less it works, the more they're going to make money because they're going to keep charging us to have more and more and more of it. I could go on and on, but let's talk about Vioxx. You know, what's so frustrating about this vaccine issue is that you have Merck that put out a product like Vioxx that they lost in court for having killed over 50,000 people. Some people say that number goes up into the hundreds of thousands, but let's just say they killed 50,000 people. They had to pay a $3 billion fine. And when they were in court, what we saw in their emails, that they literally had internally in their emails, we will seek down the doctors that are calling out Vioxx, and we will hunt them down and destroy them where they live. That was an internal memo inside of Merck. But why is it so hard for us to imagine that this same company, Merck, might have lied on the MMR studies, might be covering up problems with the MMR vaccine that they've created, which is exactly what Dr. William Thompson at the CDC is saying has happened. But we won't touch that subject. We can all sit here and talk about how dangerous it is, the overprescription of these drugs, and how the tests aren't being done and the clinical trials aren't being done right. But we can't talk about vaccines because they never lie. Vaccines are the perfectly developed substance for every single person alive. And they're being mandated. And more than mandated, they're now being forced. Forced vaccinations now in California. I don't have a mandate that I have a choice in. My kids cannot go to school unless I get the entire 72. You want to talk about too many vaccinations? Everyone up here on this table maybe had 5 or 10 vaccinations. My kids have to get 72. We need to stop this now. I want to get vaccines to the point where it can be involved in this discussion, where I can walk out the door if I don't think it's safe. When I can prove it's not safe, when I can prove it doesn't have efficacy, when I can show you that the mumps outbreak was everybody was vaccinated with it and it did not work. In fact, Merck is in court right now because the mumps strain has never worked, and the FDA knew it, and they called them out on it. And when they called them out on it, they went into their labs, and they used rabbit's blood, and they did every other type of thing that the insiders are now telling us happened. Yet still we defend Merck, still we defend vaccines, and we say we cannot. This is the greatest invention of the 20th century. We cannot talk about it. And you want to talk about a drug that's made for a few, but given to all. Look at the HPV vaccine. This is one of the greatest abominations in medicine we have ever seen. We are talking about a virus, HPV, that 95% of all women will clear out of their bodies naturally. But do we care that it's only 5% that perhaps even need this, and out of that 5%, only 5% of them will even get cervical cancer from it? This tiny little group of people that might get cervical cancer from the HPV vaccine, instead we're going to vaccinate every girl in sight and every boy in sight. The CDC wants to vaccinate 9 to 26-year-old boys and girls with the HPV vaccine. And if you go online, you will see paralysis and death and reports that you cannot believe. So horrific, the side effects of this vaccine. And all the manipulations of a study, a placebo that was filled with a neurotoxin, aluminum, and all of the junk in the placebo, that's not a placebo. No one up here on this table would accept that as a placebo in a single drug test. They want saltwater placebos. That's what we should have in a vaccine. Why are they filling it with all of the crap except for the virus itself? This is the discussion we really need to be having, and I'm appreciative of the discussion we're having about drugs, but vaccines, we are not getting a choice. And they're being put into our babies and our children and our daughters and our sons and our mothers and our grandmothers, and we are getting sicker and sicker and sicker and needing more and more of these drugs we're talking about because they're destroying us. We need to stand up now and fight for our freedom.
It's only, you know, Viax is only the tip of the iceberg. Merck of Germany created the gas during the Second World War. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget these were the people who created the gas. Let's not forget the Supreme Court of the United States took away the ability for American citizens to sue the vaccine companies. Right. This is the only country in the world that your Supreme Court that's supposed to protect the American citizen took your right away to protect your children, your loved ones.
So I guess, first let me just say that I invited all these people to come. They all have their own points of view. They don't necessarily represent one another's point of view, so each person is, even though they're together on a panel, they all have their own completely distinct points of views that might be different. So let's stick with that for a second, because the question is, with clinical trials, if we're saying that we are concerned about the accuracy of them, that we think there could be bias in clinical trials, and there's bias in medical journals, and there's ghostwriting, and all these things are an attempt to get people to feel better about a product than the actual results might be. Why is it seem that with vaccines it's so clear? Why are people feeling so clear and so certain that they are safe when they do seem to fall into the same category as any other drug, that they're a product that's sold by a company that they want people to buy? What is the reason that this is being accepted and trusted where there's questions about regular drugs?
It's been well-planned brainwashing and propagandization over generations. I mean, the biggest debate I've ever seen is not on religion, it's on vaccines. Go out and tell people you're against vaccines. See what happens.
You don't take your blood pressure medicine, you don't give another person blood pressure. But the ostracization of a parent that doesn't vaccinate their child for the fear that they're going to be typhoid Mary, because it's not my field in practice, but people come to me looking for natural healers that will support them. You can't find a pediatrician in Detroit, or very few, that would work with a parent that wants to avoid. They're on the fringe. They're really on their own, and they're left out to dry. It's very scary.
They may be called on the fringe, but are they really on the fringe?
No. Yeah, they just have no support in the medical community.
This is not my area of expertise. I really do not want to get into this argument. But it does have to be said that vaccines have been a tremendous health lifesaver, and we'd be in terrible shape without them. And places that don't have vaccines are in terrible shape, and there have been dreadful diseases, and I think you'd be a lot more effective as an advocate if you could tell both sides of the story. If you were able to indicate the ways they're helpful and indicate the shortcomings in the way it's done, then I could believe you. But you're so extreme in this, so one-sided, that you're not seeing the benefits, you're only seeing the harms. He's not extremist in this room. He's extremist in the world.
This is not your expertise, but do you know anything about that? Do about ethyl mercury? Do you know what ethyl mercury is?
It's the stuff that's used in the vaccines that kids
It's
get.
in every
Used to
single
be.
vaccine in the world. We have less in this country than any.
Of course.
Because of one congresswoman that came through the Institute 20 years ago. Ethyl mercury destroys brain cells, neurons in the nervous system. And it's intentionally placed in vaccines, intentionally, because when it's challenged, they say it's an inexpensive preservative. Read last year's book, Thimerosal, authored by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's an environmental attorney, and it's really a Harvard physician and a Tufts University's physician who are experts in this. That's the most poignant book out of the hundreds I've read on the subject. Learn about it. Aluminum is in 100% of vaccines in the world. These are destructive elements. So yes, it's true. Polio has gone away because of this. Typhoid fever has gone away. Yes, they're in a lot worse shape in those countries, but the truth of the matter is nobody's saying we should be against vaccines. We're against what we're doing to vaccines. That's what he said. I heard him say it earlier.
Go ahead.
I think that the reason why we don't have a reasonable debate about vaccines is because many of them were identified early on with giant steps in public health. And when we think about the true medical giants, people like Louis Pasteur and so forth, and the fight against some of these diseases, well, I mean, it's hard to get a debate going because that's really linked to the time when medicine and research were not about profits, but about trying to do the right thing and indeed achieving the right thing at times. But the issue in many ways is how we ended up using some of these preservatives or anti-infectious agents or things like that, some of which did work. I mean, we have an epidemic of mercury poisoning in this country. Everybody, I look at the average age here. Many of you have mouths full of mercury, and it's a very serious problem. And you may be having neurotoxicity as a result of that. You may not be, I don't know. But what happens is that some of these agents, and it could be lead, it could be mercury, they start being used for whatever reason, and then we find out, and maybe the information is suppressed for a long time, and that certainly was the case with lead and mercury, that they are bad. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because medicine and dentistry and fields like that, they're very institutionalized. And once they gravitate towards using a certain element, they're going to use it. And then they're going to suppress evidence against it. And it's an old story. And I think we do have to have a lively debate about these things. And we can't say that simply because some vaccines from the past were good, and maybe even the use of some heavy metals against infection, I mean, that's since really probably Hippocrates that they used, the Greeks and the Romans used some of these heavy metals against infection. They're no good. We have to find another way, and just because we become institutionalized doesn't mean we should be institutionally lazy. And that's and medicine and dentistry are somewhat institutionally lazy. They do have tried and true ways, and they don't want to deal with the problems that have emanated over the years. My take.
All right, I'm getting coached on how to better deliver this message. So my bedside manner needs improvement. That's the life of a creative filmmaker and actor as a kid. Look at, you know, there's many ways to look at this, but I think what makes me intense on this subject is imagine, I get your passion about the overuse of drugs and the over-prescription of drugs in children. Imagine a world where those are being mandated and you know how bad they are for those kids. And I find myself now fighting, and I am angry, and I am intense, and I am upset because my kids can't walk out of the room. Every other product we're talking about here, we can walk out of the room and say, I don't want it. And we're not being allowed that, and it's getting more and more intensely egregious. And you talk about the sales of fear of a disease. I mean, it's amazing. I agree with absolutely everything you say when it comes to drugs, and I just don't understand how there's this line been drawn in the sand. And let me just finish. That somehow vaccines get this free ride. I mean, it's the exact same thing. We sell a fear of measles, a disease that was a Brady Bunch episode. Now, people may decide that they don't want their kids to have measles, and that's a choice, and they may decide that they want to put their kids on one of these drugs you're talking about, and maybe the disease is bad, but we know that measles in this country, where we have running showers and water and sewage, doesn't actually kill anybody, yet we put up with a news agency that calls it deadly, 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 though no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It really does not.
Young infants. It kills young infants and children with immune-compromised systems, so it does kill.
I'd like to see the report you have on that, the amount of deaths in the U.S. this year, actual measles deaths. And then you talk about the amount of people that are getting autism and are getting all of these autoimmune diseases. And we can't get the studies that prove that it's happening published in the journals, the same journals you don't trust, when you just talked about drugs. I mean, I just don't understand how all of the terms that you're giving to drugs and your questioning of how drugs are slipping through the system, yet you just have a free ride with vaccines.
I didn't say that I didn't trust the medical journals. What I'm saying is that sometimes bad data gets into the medical journals. And an incident of bad data that got into a medical journal was Andrew Wakefield's scientific, so-called scientific article that vaccines cause autism. And it was discredited over and over again and debunked over and over again. And
Not
the
true.
scientific consensus,
But,
the
you know,
scientific
but-
consensus in the United States is that what he did was commit fraud.
No,
and
that's not- no,
article
that is
was-
not actually-
And that
that-
article was
that's not true.
retracted from the medical journal. And the scientific consensus is that vaccines do not
What was the
cause
fraud?
autism.
What was the fraud?
Let me
That-
No, I'm
comment.
just curious, if you're going to use the word fraud, name exactly what the fraud
That's exactly what
was.
the scientific
Okay, I'd like-
consensus was, so go ahead.
The medical profession in the United Kingdom investigated, and he was removed as a doctor
That's right.
for scientific fraud.
Yes.
No.
Yes, he
No,
was.
no, no. No, no, I will clarify.
Not allowed to practice as a doctor.
I will clarify.
Okay, so let's
He was- no,
go.
let me
let's
just, let me
not
just clarify
let's
one
not-
word.
Let's not get stuck on Wayfield. How about
I
MIT?
just want to clarify one word, that I'm not saying that he did not lose his license. What I'm saying is he did not lose his license for fraud. And there's an important discussion to be had there. Fraud was never proved. Fraud was never claimed by the GMC. He lost his license for medical misconduct. And if you'd like to talk about the definition of that,
You're
and the
splitting
fact
hairs.
that there's 13 scientists on the study. The only other scientist that lost his license for the same medical misconduct just was reinstated last year because he appealed. He appealed the decision and fought it all the way through a real court system. And the judge, in an 80-page rebuke of the GMC, said that the Lancet paper should be reinstated and that the GMC acted egregiously in this situation. So one of the two doctors, the only difference between Andy Wakefield and Professor John Walker Smith, who just got his license back, is that Professor Wakefield did not fight to appeal. He decided to continue his journey warning parents of what he believed was the danger in the vaccine.
Look at what Dr. Seneff, who's the statistician at MIT, said last year. Let's get over Wakefield, who may be controversial. I think MIT is an institution that's almost beyond reproach when it comes to science. If your child gets into MIT, they must be geniuses, and the professors are beyond geniuses. Mostly Nobel laureates go there to work if they can get a job. Dr. Seneff came out and said exactly what Wakefield said. Nobody took her license away.
I think you sort of asked me, why do I feel differently about drugs and vaccines? I don't. I think in both instances, it's important to present both sides of the story. Where I find you radical and extreme and passionate is that you present one side of the story very well and you ignore the other part. The other part in this case, and I think you'd be much more credible, I would believe you strongly if you could be more moderate. The other part of the story is that in the history of mankind, vaccines are one of the great advances and one of the wonderful things that have saved life and improved health. So you can't say, I'm against all vaccines. You're against the misuse of vaccines with chemicals that may not be in them, that may not be necessary. You want to improve the system, not destroy it. But that's not clear in the way you present it. The other point is that you loosely say that the vaccines cause autism. Now again, you can cry fraud everywhere. There is fraud in some places, but there's not fraud everywhere. When there have been many, many studies done in many countries with millions and millions of people that fail to demonstrate a connection between being vaccinated or not being vaccinated, having mercury, not having mercury, and autism. And the claim that you make is it's definitely proven that it causes autism. You lose credibility. Now you could take me along with you if you said that we are possibly doing things that are harmful. We need to study it more. We need to prevent this from happening if there's danger. But I have an open mind, and I'm aware of the benefits, that the vaccines have benefits. I'm aware of the risk, but I'm not exaggerating them. For effect, you're a dramatist, you're a creative artist. For effect, you present the strongest possible case, but you present it so strongly that you undercut yourself, is my point.
Okay. And I just want to say that if you look at the HPV vaccine ad that's running on television now, it says cures HPV, says will stop me from getting cervical cancer if I get the vaccine. There's nothing in that statement by the medical establishment that's showing both sides. Doesn't talk about side effects, doesn't talk about the dangers of the vaccine, doesn't talk about the fact that it only covers a small fraction of the different forms of HPV, okay? So the other side apparently is allowed to just make dramatic statements of efficacy and safety. But if I don't include all of the great parts of it, then somehow I'm being...
No, the point is never trust a drug company for whatever they say on anything, of course not. But when you're dealing with the WHO, the National Health Service, the Cochrane Group reviews, the CDC, which you think is completely corrupt, the Institute of Medicine, when all of these people are saying there is no link between vaccines and autism. And on the other side, you have this one guy in the CDC and Andy Wakefield.
And about 200,000 parents.
Well, parents...
Yes, about 200,000 parents is right.
Let me be very clear about that. I understand that many of you may have kids with autism and that you've suffered hell, and I wouldn't, my heart, I can cry just thinking about it. And I have experience with autism, not personal in my family, but I've known many families with it. I understand how terrible it is. But the judgment that your kid got autism because he took a vaccination is not science. And you have to really look at millions of people where on the one hand the kids got the vaccine, the other hand the kids didn't, and see whether there are statistical differences.
Wait a minute, are you suggesting there's no possibility in any case in history that a child may have gotten?
No, of course not.
Okay, so if there is one child enough to know?
You have have to balance.
No, I'm asking you a question. You're saying research.
What you have
Is
to-
research
you have to
worth
balance,
a life?
yeah, you have to balance risks and benefits. For the kid who may be, and it's hypothetical, but suppose that, I believe that everything has harms. So undoubtedly, vaccination has harms for some kids, but it's a risk-benefit. You have to think about what the world would be like if kids weren't vaccinated, and think of all the damage that would be done to kids
But you're
who
saying,
weren't
you're saying
vaccinated.
something quite different than you said a minute ago.
No.
Yes, you are. You're saying something quite different. You're saying there's no scientific proof that vaccines are connected with autism. I challenge that.
Yeah. There's
Just
no-
because there's research that says, for instance, there's research that happens to say that chemotherapy and radiation actually prolongs lifespan, not shortens lifespan. Nobody would come to Chernobyl on a holiday with me, though. That's hard to understand.
That is hard for me to understand.
I know it is. Chernobyl's where you get cancer, by the way.
I just want to also say that if there's a benefit to vaccines and the benefits we look at, I mean, much of that is as anecdotal as the parents talking about the danger to their child. If a parent coming home and saying 5 hours ago my child just got a vaccine and now they're dead, and they say to their doctor, my child died after the vaccine, and the doctor says that's not because of the vaccine, that's a coincidence, which is what happens in every one of these stories, then how are we going to get accurate, what is really happening? And I get that, I too trusted the IOM and the CDC and the FDA and all of these too. I mean, I've reported on these things for years and years and years. And it's extremely hard to accept, and it's very depressing to see that all of these things seem to have infiltration from the outside. All I really want is what you just said. I want a vaxxed versus an unvaccinated study that's actually done by a totally independent group that says, are the rates of autism in the unvaccinated community? You could grab every chiropractor in this nation that isn't vaccinating their kid and say, what are your rates of autism? What are your rates of diabetes? What are your rates of autoimmune diseases? Let's start there. Let's do the study every other drug gets, which is really the basic placebo study. This group got it, this group didn't. Who's doing better? We have never had that study. The CDC has been paid for it. They've never done it. So unlike you, that you want to trust the 14 studies that were done across the nation, and if you really read through them, they're fairly shoddy. And even the MMR study, in its standard, in way it's stated, is a mess. And then Thompson show us how it's an even bigger mess than we realized. But all I want is real science. And what I want is a totally independent health agency starting to test all these vaccines. It's egregious that we are combining the MMR vaccine, the varicella vaccine, the DTaP vaccine, all on the same visit in one child. And it's never been tested. You wouldn't do that with a single drug. We have never, ever, ever, ever done a test seeing what happens when we put all of these vaccines in a child at one time. Why aren't we doing that test? I'm supposed to trust the IOM and the CDC and all the WHO when they aren't doing the most basic safety testing we should all be expecting for something being injected into babies? I don't think I'm being that irrational. What is irrational is the defense of a system that isn't going through the standard protocol we all expect, not as doctors, but as high school science students.
The problem I have with the makeup of this panel is that what you have are several people who are experts in the pharmaceutical industry and drugs, okay, and I count Dr. Francis and Jim Lieber and Dr. Kahn, and myself, I'm a journalist, okay, I do research and I do a lot of research, but I'm not, quote, a medical expert. But the problem, what we have here are, we have a journalist who's very passionate and I believe is extreme on the issue of vaccines. What we don't have on this panel are experts on vaccines. And so, it's kind of left to Dr. Francis and myself and maybe Jim Lieber to dredge up what little we know about vaccines. And basically what I know about vaccines are what I've read in the newspaper and also in some of the medical journals. It would have been probably more objective and more helpful to you as an audience to have true experts here on vaccines, or someone like Seth Mnookin, who wrote about vaccines, or some of the scientists who were on those panels who from credible medical institutions who did study after study and found that there is no link between vaccines and autism. But we don't have them on this panel. So it's difficult for myself and it's difficult for Dr. Francis to rebut, this vaccines. And I guess that, so I'm having a problem, I think this panel is trying to do too much, and there either should have been just a panel on vaccines with people from both sides of the fence. I think that would have been more balanced, or a panel on people who know something about drugs and on both sides of the fence.
Well, let me just give you a couple of observations. You didn't include me. For 45 years, I've worked with people, not many, but probably 300 as a result of vaccines with the families. And so I am an expert in that. And number two, you're sitting here and graciously banging the corruption across the board with the pharmaceutical industry and how fraudulent it is, but you're unwilling to say part of the pharmaceutical industry, the vaccine part of the industry, that only one that's protected by the Supreme Court, is somehow not in that loop. I mean, I have a difficult time with that. I have a real difficult time with that.
The basic, and again, this is, I think, a discussion we should probably end, but the basic point isn't that we should trust the vaccine makers. The basic point is that we should be getting more safety stuff. The basic point is that there may be better ways of doing it without so many and so concentrated. But to deny the value of vaccines is absolutely crazy.
I don't think have I
Well,
denied
yeah,
the
you're too passionate one way. You're too passionate one way. You don't start out by saying vaccines, let me finish. Vaccines are crucial to life. They are.
How many in this room, raise your hand, heard him ever say that vaccines were bad?
A world without vaccines is in terrible shape. Stop a second. That the world without vaccines is in terrible shape. I'm not saying, and I know you'll say a little bit, oh yeah, I'm not saying that, but your passion is all in one direction. A balanced...
Children are being poisoned without
but if there were no vaccines, if everyone listened to you when we remove vaccines, there would be disaster in this country.
I just called for look, we can move on. And I think that we have an understanding, and I don't think I said we should remove all vaccines from the nation. That wasn't my point at any point this evening. I believe testing needs to take place. I think we need to get to the bottom of what's really happening here. And what I'm saying is we should still always have a choice. You cannot have a product that has taken away. What are the incentives for the pharmaceutical industry to make sure the product is safe if you mandate it, so you take away a consumer choice? Consumer choice is one of the ways that the drugs we're talking about get made better. I'm going to go with this one because it's made better, or I'm not going to use that because it has too many side effects. Consumer choice is one of the ways that we force the pharmaceutical industry to make a better product. The only other way, so you take that away with mandates, the only other thing you're left with is the ability to sue if the product damages you or your child. And so that's the only thing you have left to make sure that the pharmaceutical industry does its job and continues to test and make a better product.
Is there any value to mandates? Why do we have mandates? Why has the government had mandates? Is there any value to mandates?
I think that mandates, when we say the word mandates, what it is a strong suggestion across the nation that everybody vaccinate. And under that strong suggestion, in most states where we've had exemptions for religious or personal belief and people that do research and think, or they don't want to take all of the vaccinations.
Is there a public health reason?
I think the public health reason is to protect people from disease, and that strong suggestion has worked completely. We have over 95% uptake in all of our children in this nation, and I wouldn't be sitting here and I wouldn't be passionate had I not lived in a state that took away all of our rights to make any choice whatsoever in it. I don't mind a strong suggestion, I don't mind a mandate, but you should always have personal belief and religious exemptions, because that tiny group of people that may want to to try living their life a different way, that want to either just go with fewer vaccines, not the entire 72 mandated, and I believe there's more coming. HPV is going to be added onto it. There's 300 vaccines in the pipeline that are all being developed. I think the future of this industry is looking very strongly at vaccines, and if they can mandate them on us, I think the reason that they're in Washington, they're now the most powerful lobby in Washington, is not just to push the drugs you're worried about, but to actually buy our politicians to push more vaccines onto a mandated schedule, because that's the best moneymaker there is, a product that we have no choice about.
What company wouldn't want to make a product that you can't be sued over?
Is the only reason for mandates drug company corruption, or is there a public health reason that good doctors who you would trust would think it's maybe worth it from a public health standpoint, or is it just drug corruption?
I think that mandates are a belief system in the allopathic medical world that it protects people.
And that killed people in California.
Didn't kill
because there
anybody.
were
That's
so
a
many
lie.
parents
That's an
that
absolute
because
lie.
there
Nobody
was-
died.
Excuse me.
Nobody
but
died.
I'm talking now and you're
But
not.
you said the word
I mean,
killed.
so stop interrupting.
Okay.
Be polite. At any rate, the point is that there was a measles outbreak in California because so many parents were not getting their children vaccinated. And it was the very young children and it was the immunocompromised children that were killed. So there is, as Dr. Francis is trying to suggest, there's a very valid public health reason for mandating vaccines. Now, I think we can all agree that that we need to study vaccines. They need to be as safe as possible, but there is a very strong public health reason for giving all school-age children vaccines. And
But
should
we wait to give the vaccines until they're studied? Should we wait to
See,
administer these?
I'm not an expert, so
Well,
I don't know the
but
degree to which vaccines are studied, perhaps.
We're
And
very,
that's why
very,
there's a
very little.
problem with this panel, because we don't have the
Well,
experts
we've heard
who know
about the
about
problem
that
with the panel,
research.
but since you brought it up, there's a few things that you didn't state correctly about the measles outbreak at Disneyland. Nobody died. In fact, every one of those people are doing better than almost everybody else in this country because they will be immune to measles for the rest of their life, unlike those that are being vaccinated for. Are going to have to keep going trip after trip after trip, injecting themselves with more aluminum and neurotoxins to try and keep up with those people that now have lifelong immunity because they happen to be at Disneyland that day. No, I mean, and on top of that, most of the cases were adults, and not a single case spread into the school system in California, even though they're trying to use this as a giant fear-mongering tactic. It didn't spread anywhere. And when we want to really talk about the dangerous numbers, it was 130-something cases out of, I think, over 75,000 to 100,000 people that traveled through Disneyland that weekend. And if you really look at the largest outbreak of measles in the nation at 644 cases, which we were bludgeoned over the head with by every single news agency for day upon day upon day about how tragic this measles outbreak was in 644 cases. And then you got to look at the numbers. 644 cases out of 320 million people is 0.0000002% of society got measles.
Suppose the people there hadn't been vaccinated.
All right, let me ask you
How many
this.
cases would there have been?
I'm going to do something else. Can everyone in this room that has not had a booster for measles in the last 10 years, please raise your hand? Everyone that has not had a booster, okay? You are the danger to the society because you're no longer immune. The vaccine wears off. We know that. That's why there's boosters. So the real harm is not the children we're mandating these on. It's the fact that we're going to have to mandate them on you and everybody else in this room because we are not vaccinated for measles any longer. So let's be honest about what the situation is. Herd immunity can't be accomplished because of all of these people that just raised their hands. So where are we going with this? How did you not get measles this year? How are all these people standing? How are we living when all the people you just saw raise their hand, including yourself, have not gotten your booster for measles? So this thing, where are we really at? What is the truth? That's what we're talking about. We need to start asking these very, very appropriate, important questions on this subject.
In a world where we stopped vaccinating kids for measles, we might do okay. We might do okay for a while. But we might do okay for a while, but eventually we would get back to measles being a tremendous killer. And I don't think you can deny that. I don't think you can deny that.
I'm sure we want to move on from this
Not a bad
topic.
idea.
Yeah, 15 minutes, there we go.
I would like to just comment that part of the concern with the Real Truth About Health conference, with the 30 authors we invited, was that a lot of the information they were saying was being adamantly attacked. The man in the audience who was commenting, his name's Mark Maslin. He's a climatologist. It's only in the last 5 years that the public is buying in and accepting the climate stuff he's saying. Brian Clement speaks about, and his wife Anna Marie Clement, promote a raw food, low fruit diet. It has been proven so unbelievably effective, and yet throughout the world it's attacked, it's ridiculed. Joel Kahn is a cardiologist recommending a whole food plant-based diet. He should be on the cover of Time magazine every week instead of the Eat Butter. So, Alison Bass is saying that is talking about the over-prescribing of antidepressants. Jim Lieber is saying that medicine's the third leading cause of death. These people are it's the same issue. These people are attacked because other people are reading something else. So the question always is, what is everyone's source? I know we have strong beliefs. In a couple of days, we're going to have a guy talking about water fluoridation. Everyone thinks it's great. This guy happened to do the research and says it's not great. So again, the question is, there's a lot of smart people, there's a lot of confident people. What is the real source of their information? Most people don't want to do the research because it's a pain in the neck to do it and it's hard. So they just believe what they say in the magazines and the papers. But if the magazines and papers are owned by industries that have huge bias, how do we know what we're actually reading? So I'm not qualified to comment on any of this stuff other than to say that in all cases it's frustrating when anyone ever has an opinion on anything that they got from someone else who, said something. So that's my thought on it.